So you remember we started with how to make a god, talked about religion and anthropomorphism. We then went to how to make a monster. We talked about Freud and the id and monster culture, which was pretty interesting. Basically, the monster is a symbol of the other. It's a symbol of difference, and it serves that function. Then we looked at two ancient texts from Greece and Mesopotamia, the Theogony by Hesiod and Enuma Elish from Mesopotamia. And we saw some pretty disturbing things, frankly. We saw that we were born into chaos, and we fight our way through chaos, and maybe don't get past chaos. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see what happens in this story. But it was a pretty sobering look at the birth of gods and monsters. And what we saw was that gods and monsters come from the same place. They come from inside us. They come from inside our cultures. And they come from the stories we tell as a result of our psychology and our culture. So tonight, let's start with three ancient goddesses. There are many. I'm just choosing these three for my own reasons. These are Inanna, or Ishtar, Anat, and Isis. Hard to say that name these days, since it's been taken over by something else, but this is the original Isis, a nurturing, loving goddess, also a pretty badass goddess, by the way, as all of these goddesses are. Inanna, or Ishtar, from Mesopotamia. Really interesting goddess. These Ishtar, Anat, and Isis are not the goddesses you may know of goddess theology, for example. These are not nurturing, life-affirming women. These goddesses will kill you happily, or they'll have sex with you happily. Sometimes at the same time. So Inanna is a full-fledged goddess, and she has a suitor named Dumuzi. But she and another god, Uta, tries to put Dumuzi with Dumuzi, who's immortal, with Inanna, and she's having none of it. She says he's just a shepherd. Right? As opposed to a farmer. She wants a farmer. Now, why she wants a farmer will become clear pretty soon. But he's a shepherd, so he spends a lot of time alone, and like many shepherds, he's a poet. And so he wins her over. He wins Inanna over with his words. And he compares what a shepherd can do to what a farmer can do. Okay? These goddess myths are R-rated, by the way, just so you know. She responds passionately to Dumuzi's courting of her and says the following: "Who will plow my vulva? Who will plow my high field? Who will plow my wet ground? Who will station the ox there?" Happy Valentine's Day. As you see, this is agricultural metaphors. That is not just, dressing. That's the meaning of the phrases. Because what's being addressed here is life, water and bread, right? So Inanna, in fact, all these goddesses are very much concerned with the agricultural cycle. And it makes sense that you would have a goddess in an agricultural civilization because that's about birth and death all the time, right? Not so much in a hunter-gatherer society, but in an agricultural society, or civilization, you are a civilization because you can stop roaming, right? You don't have to hunt for game or berries or whatever. You can stand still by a river, and the river will flood or not. And your life depends on the emergence of the harvest, of the crops and the harvest, or not. So there's a symmetry here between the cosmos and the story that we're not used to. We like the separation. Oh, this is a story. It may mean this. Not for them. There was no gap, right? And in fact, I hope at some point during these discussions we'll get to talk about the amazing Popol Vuh, the Mayan story, which is a collection of myths, but it's also astronomy. It's also agriculture. The stories tell you where everything is in the sky and what to do when that happens. It's amazing. Same thing's going on here. This is not just sitting around the campfire storytelling. This is, although it is that, this is life and death. This is the emergence of food or the lack of food. Who will plow my volva? Plow. Who will plow my high field? Who will plow my wet ground? Who will station the ox there? We laugh, and it is kind of funny, like bad erotic fiction. But for them, it was different. All right, so this works. Yes?
Just before we move on, I've like in a lot of, I guess, like comparative mythology and just like mythology in general, I've always assumed, like if Terence McKenna says this too, at Food for the Gods, but they like categorize it in such a way that like pre-agricultural civilization was lunar and like associated with feminine, like with all of the fertility.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't until the like agricultural / like Bronze Age did it go to fully solar.
Right. I'm so glad you brought that up. As usual, you always bring up something really interesting. Actually, I think I want to talk about that at the end.
Okay.
But I do want to talk about it, so thank you. Remind me if I get, how I get going, and don't let me forget to address that.
What was her question?
Her question was about the depiction of goddesses and gods in agricultural society and pre-agricultural society. So she's talking about what I mentioned last time, this notion of a prehistorical goddess culture. Okay, and we're going to address that. All right, there are statues of Inanna and Dumuzi, and they're embracing each other, and he has an erect penis, and she's grabbing him, and he's grabbing her. This was a different culture, not influenced by the Puritans as we are. And this is not gratuitous. This means life. It means human life, as in reproduction. It means life of the sun, of the sky fertilizing the earth, and a harvest coming. But poor Dumuzi, he lives and dies by the harvest. And so immediately there's a drought. What do we do with Dumuzi? We depose him. Because if you're a king and you're not bringing fecundity to the earth, that's your fault, not the goddess's fault in this culture at this time. And so he's deposed. He's no longer king. Now, there's a lot to this story, and I'm cutting out a few things for the sake of time, but basically, Inanna has to recover the earth, and so she descends into the underworld. This is another common theme. There are other reasons for her going there that I won't get into. She spends some time down there, actually, with her sister. She actually ends up dead, the goddess, but she is revived like a seed in the ground. She is revived, but you can't leave the underworld if you've been dead there, unless you get a substitute. Who could be the substitute to take my place in the underworld? Dumuzi, get your ass over here. You're going to the underworld. So sure enough, Dumuzi takes Inanna's place in the underworld, but he's released every spring. Release every spring. This myth sound familiar? Demeter and Persephone, right? Antedates that myth probably, but still. So again, this is a goddess. She is part of the life cycle of rain and harvest and planting, etc. And her fate is tied to that. And that's her. You can see she's pretty fecund herself. She's designed to look like she's giving birth or capable of giving birth. I don't know if you've heard of Sargon of Akkad, but he really appropriates the story for himself. He's the great Akkadian king, about 24th century BCE. This is really old. This is right around the time of writing, by the way. And so he appropriates the story by naming a priestess instead of a priest, for example, to tap into the power of Inanna Ishtar. All right, Anat of Ugarit. Again, kind of Middle Eastern. This would be where Syria is today. She is the daughter of El and Asherah. And if the name El sounds familiar, it should. It's all over the Hebrew Bible. It's the name of God that the Hebrews took from Mesopotamia. And in fact, Israel is that name of God, Israel. Anytime you see the El in Hebrew, it's probably referring to the Babylonian god and his consort Asherah. There's a lot about Asherah in the Hebrew Bible, by the way. She's depicted by a tree. She's even sometimes depicted as Yahweh's consort, Yahweh's lover. She is a war goddess. You can see from her statue, this is not that you're thinking. She's actually supposed to be holding a weapon, but it still looks pretty cool. She fights on behalf of her brother Baal, and she loves battle. She loves it. Let me give you some lines from the Baal cycle, it's called. When she finds out that Baal has been threatened by another brother, Mont, it says, her liver shook with laughter. Her heart was filled with joy. The liver of Anat with triumph. This woman wants blood. When later her father suggests that Baal should not have his place. This is always about their place in the kingdom. And El suggests that Baal maybe doesn't deserve his place. She turns on her father, El. She's ready to take him out. This is what she says. I will make his gray hair run with blood, the gray hair of his beard with gore, if he does not give a house to Baal like the gods. All right.
Lady Macbeth.
Right. Well, you mentioned Kali, too. This is a description of Anat. Under her, like balls, are heads. Above her, like locusts, hands. Like locusts, heaps of warrior hands. She fixes heads to her back, fastens hands to her belt. These are severed hands. Knee-deep she gleans in warrior blood, neck-deep in the gore of soldiers. There's your goddess. Not exactly the nurturing great mother who comes way, way later. Right, it's only her mother, Asherah, who finally steps in and keeps her from killing her father. All right, that is Anat. Isis of Egypt. We love Isis. Many stories about Isis. She and her brother Osiris were twins, and it is said they loved each other from the womb. So they are brother and sister. They are husband and wife, as these things go. And of course, there's a brother. There's always a brother who's ready to mess things up. This in Egypt is Seth, and he is out to destroy Osiris, the brother and lover of Isis. So there are many ways, or not many, but there's a few ways he does this in the story. One is that he makes a coffin and he tricks Osiris into getting into it. Remember, this is not the logical, this is the mythological, okay? So this doesn't have to make sense because it's working symbolically. Puts Osiris in it, slams the lid, sends him off, throws him in the ocean. He washes ashore at a place called Byblos, where there was an Osiris cult, and becomes a tree. So I love this story. He just lands there, a tree grows up around him, and he's inside the tree. And that's kind of the point for Seth, is to make his brother disappear. And he does, but not from Isis. She finds him. In fact, she goes to Byblos because she's conjured that he's there, and she makes herself a servant to the king there, just so she can exist there. But then they're building a new temple, and they need a pillar, and so they cut down the tree that has Osiris in it. She takes the tree, takes Osiris, they take the tree, she takes Osiris, and lies him out on the ground, and conjures an erection from the dead Osiris, right? Because she knows that she's the vehicle for life. She must reproduce. And Osiris, her love, is dead, so she conjures an erection as he's dead. Sometimes she comes in the form of a hawk and lands on him, other times it's just her. And of course, he impregnates her. And the child is Horus, who is, of course, now attacked by Seth. And again, this is a story of kingship and succession and who will rule and who will have his sphere, his realm, right? That's what all this is about. The goddesses are used toward that end, whether it's by Sargon or Seth or Baal. They are feared, make no mistake. In fact, they're even worshipped, but it's that kind of worship that comes from fear, right? Where you're in charge of my fate, don't mess with me, keep me alive, help me, that kind of thing. Because, as you saw, these are fierce goddesses. All right. I'm moving fairly quickly through these because I want to get to the monster. Charlie?
I'm trying to understand how that story benefits the culture. Of the not. But we can talk about it at the end. I'm trying to understand, if you're telling this within the culture, what would the benefit be?
Well, the immediate benefit would be that Anat is on your side, and that's how you came to be there. Right? So myths are always about the present, even though they talk about the past. So you would tell that story and say something like, just as Anat defeated Mot, I have defeated, right? So that's the immediate thing. It's a rhetorical device, actually. But there are other things that we can talk about. You're right. Yeah.
I don't know how many versions of the myth of Osiris there are, but
several.
So the one I've heard is that Seth actually cut him up.
That's right.
And threw him into the river, and then somehow
Osiris finds him.
Isis was able to find him.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Piece them together, and somehow how many versions are there of this? It's like
there are probably about half dozen. But that is one of them, and thank you for reminding me of that, because that's probably the one most people know, and I skipped over it, is how he is split apart by Seth, and Isis puts him back together. And so you may find this in other goddesses, this energy of integration as opposed to separation. Actually, we're going to see that in the next monster story. But just think about that. Goddesses being about integration, monsters and men being about separation. Thank you for reminding me of that. You know, the ending of that story is she doesn't find his penis. It's swallowed by a river crab. And apparently river crabs are still hated in Egypt to this day. That is part of these stories. As you're going to see, these are also constellations moving. And that's part of the genius of the Popol Vuh, is that it takes that to a whole new level. Is that, like in the Popol Vuh, the Mayan story, the Pleiades are called the 100 Boys. And so the 100 boys go running around and do things. It's just the Pleiades setting, you know. So it's it's an oral culture, so you don't have writing. You don't have a way to save this. You have to remember it in story. That's a brilliant way to remember something, is to put it in a story. And so when you see, remember, there's no separation. When you see the sky at night, you are actually seeing this happen, right? There's no, oh, that's an interesting way to interpret the sky. No, that's not an option for them. You know, oh, I wonder what the Greeks would think. No, this is their culture. It's almost hermetic. I mean, there is some interaction, but early on, we don't see that much interaction. So this is going to be more integrated than we are used to. In fact, that's going to play into the goddess story. I want to come back. All right, cool. Everybody okay? All right. Still going to get pretty gory, so hang on. Sophia. Sophia is often the appellation given to goddess theology. So again, this goes to her point about was there an original goddess culture, and was it prevalent before writing, before the agricultural revolution? When you do goddess theology, you're often going to talk about Sophia. She appears in the Bible. She appears in the Gnostic writings. You can make her appear in the New Testament, if you like, with a little stretch. But let's look at who she is. Sophia appears in Proverbs 8 in a chapter on the good woman. And this is what is said of her. Or this is her speaking in Proverbs 8. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts, long ago. Really? Ages ago I was set up, at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water. Okay. Somebody didn't tell us that in Genesis, but here she is. In Proverbs, the co-creator, co-creatrix, we would say. Now, again, the goddess movement really likes this verse in this chapter because it's very exalting of Sophia. But in the context, Sophia, all this is rhetorically serving the notion of the good woman in Proverbs, who is not just a good woman, she's a good wife, right? So, and we know this because parallel and against her is the loose woman who roams the streets, trying to seduce men, right? So Sophia is set up as a binary, as good woman, good wife, loose woman. And then these other, as she is a creatrix in the service of that, just as Anat and Inanna are in the service of this larger story. Okay? By the way, I'm getting a lot of this material from Rosemary Radford Ruther's Goddesses and the Divine Feminine, if you want to follow up on some of this. She appears in the Wisdom of Ben Sira, an apocryphal book, sometimes known as Sirach. Really interesting move here. She's presented as the loose woman. Well, she's not presented as the loose woman. She uses the language of sexuality to lure men to the law. Right? To lure men to the law into doing good. And there's very erotic language there about Sophia whispering to the man, come with me, and obey the law. Wisdom of Solomon, again, a little bit later, she gets voiceless and kind of becomes degendered. Sophia becomes a principle, the principle of wisdom. This is kind of like sometimes in the New Testament, in New Testament theology, she's seen as the Holy Spirit. But as you can see, I don't know what makes that feminine, other than it's not the masculine, right? I don't know. She does appear in Gnosticism. Again, this is complicated because there are many Gnostic texts. Gnosticism was a religion out of Egypt mostly that predated Christianity, but kind of emerged with Christianity, and some would argue was the original Christianity. But it's a very Platonic religion about a pure reality above and this being a corrupt reality here. That this world is about becoming, and that world is about being, because it's unchanging, and this is always changing. So we're trying to escape all this change, because change means corruption. Change means you always change toward death, right? So there's some of these wonderfully dramatic Gnostic stories with a goddess named Pistis Sophia, or Faithful Sophia. She serves a number of roles, different roles in these Gnostic stories, but she's always kind of an in-between being. So she's never part of Gnosis. And sometimes she was part of Gnosis and fell, right? And fell into the world of corruption, but can still be a teacher, right? Now, I don't know if you know the infancy gospel of Thomas, or actually it's the gospel of Thomas as well, possibly one of the earliest gospels we have, which is the saying source mostly for Jesus. Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, but at the end, there's a gathering of disciples, and Mary is there, Mary Magdalene, and she speaks up to the risen Savior. And Peter freaks out. Peter says, well, how dare a woman speak in our midst? She's a woman. She's corrupt. And Jesus says, chill out, Peter. That's the literal translation of the Greek. Chill out, dude. And he talks to him a little while. And Peter comes back to the group and said, well, okay, it's all right because the Savior has made her a man. It's all good. She's now a man. That's the sense of the goddess, right, in world mythology, is that yes, she can have power, she can have fierce power, deadly power, but it's always in the service of something else. It's not the goddess culture that we're going to talk about in a minute. This notion of before writing, it was goddesses and everybody worshipped goddesses and there was harmony. Okay, we don't see that, and I'm going to talk about why we don't see that here. Rian Eisler and Gumbatas have suggested that you can see it in the archaeology. Except it's really hard to interpret archaeology, Anyway, we're going to get to that. And now the monster. Oh, wait. I want to do this. So, here's what we've seen so far. And this, anytime a person starts drawing charts and stuff, I get really nervous because, I don't know. I grew up a Southern Baptist, and they would pull out these charts about how you were going to suffer, and there were dragons and angels with flames, and I just don't like charts, but I did want you to kind of see what we've been seeing, at least as I see it. Going back to the Theogony and the Enuma Elish, these ancient creation stories of the gods and monsters. So what we see is emptiness, chaos, right? Then something. All right. And the Theogony, it's Gaia. is the earth. Right? In Nume Elish, it's Tiamat and Apsu, the waters above, the waters below. And then we see something else, right? Some sort of building, or maybe a principle like lust in the theogony that's generated, right? Some sort of activity. But there's like a third thing, right? And then we see that that outer circle is emptiness, chaos, possibly the feminine. Again, I suggested this last time as a reading of chaos. It's a bit of a stretch, but it's just something to think about. Chaos, emptiness. Emptiness is the literal translation of chaos. It just means emptiness. But we have come to interpret chaos as disorder. And again, I'm going to suggest something. I still don't have it worked out, but I'm going to suggest something about why that is. Then in this circle here, this yellow circle, we have liminality. We have in-between, right? We have what I call godsters, gods and monsters, right? Because we can't tell them apart. In the theogony, you can't tell them apart. The hero of the Nume Elish is a monster. He's got like 4 heads and 17 hands, and he holds the winds. He's terrifying. They're godsters. They're gods because they're powerful and they create. They're monsters because they're disordered and dangerous. So this is actually the most interesting place. We're going to come back to this. Liminality, the between, right? Godster's paradox is here, right? Because it's right on the edge of the other. Doubleness. Things are doubled here. Again, this is going to become clear, I think. Carnival is here, the upside down, the overturning of this center circle, which is going to be order. I assume you've already figured out. Carnival is a deliberate disruption of the order of society and the world. So, in the center is fullness, order, and the masculine. All right, now just, again, I'm still working this out. This is what I see in what we've been doing, is that there's this beginning, and this is time, this is psychology, this is culture. There's this outer ring, or the beginning, that's emptiness. We move into some weird places, but we're always moving toward order. And we're always moving from the feminine to the masculine as culture, people, time moves on. Here's a story, I think, about that. Rihanna, back to Rihanna. By the way, you know what that tattoo is?
Isis Ma'at.
Yeah, Isis. This is from a feminist writer named Aline Sixou. Censor the body and you censor breath and speech at the same time. Write yourself. Your body must be heard. We hear you, Rihanna. This is the story of a monster named Medusa. Is that the Medusa you know? No, that's not the Medusa you know. Her name means guardian or protectress. And she was one of 3 Gorgon sisters, and she was born beautiful. The other 2 Gorgons are immortal. Medusa is mortal. She is human. And Pindar calls her beautiful Medusa. Ovid says that she had the jealous aspiration of many suitors. Medusa. And this is what she becomes, the monster. How does a beautiful human woman become a monster? To a man, to a god, one of the most notorious gods, Poseidon. Real bastard, Poseidon. This is what the Theogony, our old friend the Theogony says. Poseidon, he of the dark hair, lay with one of these Gorgons, Medusa, in a soft meadow among spring flowers. Okay, how did she get there? Ovid, in the Metamorphoses, says this: Medusa was violated in Athena's temple by the Lord of the Sea. Zeus's daughter turned away and covered her shield. That's Athena. Turned away and covered her shield to shield her virgin eyes. Because Medusa was virgin, she was serving in Athena's temple. She was dedicated to Athena. Poseidon comes in and rapes her. Or in another story, they lie in soft meadow with flowers. Athena, her goddess, turns away. And then, for fitting punishment, this is Ovid still, transformed the Gorgon's lovely hair to loathsome snakes. So, point being, Medusa has many stories around her. She has many identities. She's a victim, or she's a consort of Poseidon. Regardless, Athena, her goddess, turns her into this. And then Medusa, seeing herself transformed in such a repulsive creature, fled her home, never to return. Wandering about, abhorred, dreaded, and shunned by the rest of the world, she turned into a character worthy of her outer appearance. She becomes this. In her despair, she fled to Africa, where, while wandering restlessly from place to place, young snakes dropped from her hair. That is how, according to the ancient Greeks, that Africa has so many snakes. Again, mythological, not logical. With the curse of Athena upon her, she turned into stone whomever she gazed upon. She turned them to stone. Till at last, after a life of nameless misery, deliverance came to her in the shape of death and with the name Perseus. Perseus is the son of the Argive princess Danae and Zeus. Danae was locked away in a chamber by her father, who lived in fear of a prophecy that he would one day be killed by his son, or by her son, excuse me. The god Zeus, however, infiltrated her prison. Almost hate to say this given what's going on in the culture now, but as a golden shower, and he impregnated her. When Acrisios discovered the child, he placed Danae and Perseus in a chest and set them adrift at the sea. They were carried safely to the island of Seriphos, where they were offered refuge by the kindly fisherman Dictys. All right? And I'm just doing this through images because Medusa is about the gaze. If she's about anything, it's about seeing. And of course, so there's many paintings about this story. The ruler of Seriphos was Polydectes, Dictys' older brother. He fell in love with Danae, the mother of Perseus, but he was unable to have sex with her. Let's just pin that for a while. Now that Perseus was a grown man, so he got together his friends, Perseus among them, told him he was collecting contributions to offer for the hand of his daughter. He asked for horses from the other, but because he got no horses from Perseus, and because Perseus said he would deny him nothing, he assigned him the task of fetching Medusa's head. So, with Hermes and Athena as his guides, Perseus sought out the Graeae. These were Ino, Pythedro, and Dano. The three of them possessed only one eye and one tooth among them, which they took turns using. Perseus appropriated these. When they demanded them back, he said he would return them after they had directed him to the nymphae, or the nymphs. And when he had led when they had led Perseus to the Nymphi, he returned them their tooth and their eye. Approaching the nymphs, he received what he had come for, which was basically a backpack, a cabesus, tied his sandals on his ankles, placed his helmet on his head. He geared up, he locked and loaded. And with this helmet, it was a magical helmet, he could see everyone, but he was invisible to others. So Perseus takes flight, and he makes his way to Okeanos, the ocean, where he found the Gorgons sleeping. Now notice he is going further and further away from civilization. Among them, Medusa, the only mortal. The Gorgons' heads were entwined with horny scales of serpents, and they had big tusks like hogs, bronze hands, and wings of gold on which they flew. Okay, so we've got a mixture, kind of a hybridization going. We recognize a monster, right? All who looked at them were turned to stone, and Perseus walks through all these stone figures who have gone before him. But with Athena, the goddess, guiding his hand, he kept his eyes on the reflection in his shield as he stood over Medusa. He does not look at her, he looks at her in his shield. Think about that. And once he saw the image, he beheaded her. As soon as her head was severed, there leaped from her body the winged horse Pegasus and Creosaur. We don't know Creosaur, he just kind of disappears after this. The father of these two was Poseidon, remember, because Medusa had been raped in the temple. Perseus then places her head in the cabesus, in the backpack, heads back again. The Gorgons pursued him through the air, but the helmet kept him hidden and made it impossible for them to identify him. There they are again. There she is again. That's Rubens. There's the birth of Pegasus and Creosaur. Upon his journey back to Greece, Perseus came across the Ethiopian princess Andromeda, chained to a rock as a sacrifice to a sea monster. He slew the beast and brought her with him back to Greece as his bride. Upon reaching Seriphus, he turned that king who made him the bet to stone, and then he travels on to his grandfather's kingdom to reclaim the throne. The old man fled in fear of his life, but was later accidentally killed by Perseus, according to the oracle. What are the meanings of this myth? So many, I think. First of all, we're in the realm of paradox, right? Beauty, horror, beauty, ugliness, beauty, danger, goddess, monster, mask, mirror, poison, cure. It is said that that Athena gave some of the blood from Medusa's head to Asclepius, the healer god, because it both poisoned and cured. It's something called a pharmacon. The cure is the poison. It's a virus. It's immunization shots, right? There's Perseus, Medusa, matriarchal, patriarchal going on here. Look at this statue of Perseus and Medusa. They're virtually identical. And there's even I couldn't find it, Paul Klee has I think it's just a drawing because it's not part of his work, but it has Medusa turning away from Perseus because she can't stand what she sees. What's going on here? Again, from what we've seen, we see this gradual emergence. On the edges are emptiness, chaos, perhaps the feminine. In the liminal zone are godsters, paradox, doubleness that we've talked about. moving toward fullness or order and the masculine. Perseus, that's Perseus on Pegasus, rescuing Andromeda. That's a pretty powerful imagery. Order. Oh, okay, good. We know who the hero is. We know who the victim is. Everything's going to be all right. There's Medusa on the edge. A severed head made with snakes for hair. We're in different territory here. We're in the liminal, the uncertain. We're moving toward disorder. This is not right. To chaos, right? The original God, the first being born, chaos or emptiness. How are we to interpret this? This, again, is the French feminist theorist Aline Sixou, and I just want to read this to you because I think you should hear it. It's from a piece called The Laugh of the Medusa. Time and again, I too have felt so full of luminous torrents that I could burst with forms much more beautiful than those which are put up in frames and sold for a stinking fortune. And I too said nothing, showed nothing. I didn't open my mouth. I didn't repaint my half of the world. I was ashamed. I was afraid, and I swallowed my shame and fear. And I said to myself, you are mad. What's the meaning of these waves, these floods, these outbursts? Where is the ebullient, infinite woman who, immersed as she was in her naivete, kept in the dark about herself, led into self-disdain by the great arm of parental, conjugal phallocentrism, hasn't been ashamed of her strength? Who, surprised and horrified by the fantastic tumult of her drives, hasn't accused herself of being a monster? Who, feeling a funny desire stirring inside her to sing, to write, to dare to speak, in short, to bring out something new, hasn't thought she was sick? Well, her shameful sickness is that she resists death, that she makes trouble. You only have to look at the Medusa straight on to see her. And she's not deadly. She's beautiful. And she's laughing. All right. Thank you for your attention. What would you like to say as you process that?
Can you expand on what Victoria was talking about?
Thank you. Yes, thank you. So, right. With the publication of a woman, I think her name is Mariha Gimbutas, sorry. She's an archaeologist, and she found, a respected archaeologist, and she found all these Venus figures. You've probably seen them, right? The Venus of La Salle, and they're these very, like I was saying about, I'm sorry?
Berta.
Yeah, right. Right. Like I was saying about Inanna, right? It was Inanna. You know, the symbolism means fertility. It means fecundity. And so she found all these in many different places, and she speculated that this was this fairly global matriarchy, although she doesn't even want to say that. She wants to say goddess-worshipping cultures. Rhiannon Eisler, who I mentioned last time, picks up on this and wrote a more popularizing book called The Chalice and the Blade. And her interpretation of the archaeology is that, yes, indeed, there were goddess cultures until these hordes of men, due to climate change, came out of what is now the Russian steppes and invaded these agricultural societies and these peaceful, she called them partnership societies, as opposed to just flipping the patriarchy into making women rulers. She called them partnerships societies even. And so I taught that book before. It's a very powerful story. The only problem is you can't really do that with the archaeology. And that's why I mentioned Rosemary Radford Ruther, who's a well-known feminist theologian and religious studies person. And in her book, Goddesses and the Divine Feminine, she says, wow, I wish this were true. but I can't make it true because there's no evidence. And I love this story because what I think this is, it's attempting to make a modern myth, right? Because it's a great story. Frankly, I'd love it if we came from goddess-worshiping cultures and that men just screwed it up and we can get back, you know? I would love that.
Why do we have to go back? We don't have to. We can just go forward.
That's the difference. Come in now.
Right.
It's a different energy.
Right, so, yeah, I guess we don't. Well, they would say that we've been there and so we can get back there. I think they would probably say. But again, there's just, you can't do that with the archaeological evidence because that's a different myth, right? That's the scientific myth, by which I mean the scientific story. So you can't, and we live by the scientific story now. And so you can't create a new goddess myth in this time and place.
It's become soft science. You know?
Right,
And that's
right. I mean, you can try, but, you know, the science, you're always going to bump up against the science story. And if you keep bumping up against it and in fact, violating that story, you're not going to be heard. And that's what happened. Archaeologists said, you know, you're kind of stretching a little bit. But there was a myth forming, you know, like the Earth coming out of the ocean. This was back in the 80s. And it was so exciting. I remember, I was like, oh my God, this would be awesome if this were true. But the science story, which dominates, said no. So that's, yeah.
So you mentioned Sophia as being the divine feminine in the Jewish tradition. And in Christianity, other than Mother Mary, is there anything else that's prominent?
I wouldn't say prominent. That's a great way to put it. It has to be interpreted. So it's not obvious. So the Gospel of John is very Gnostic in nature, in trying to be not Gnostic in nature. It employs that language and that rhetoric. And interpreters can see Sophia there. It has been suggested that Sophia is the Holy Spirit. Again, and then any time wisdom is mentioned, you can say, hey, that's Sophia. Except again, it's kind of hard to make that. Well, it's not hard, it's probably too easy is the problem, right? Charlie.
How's Lilith there? Oh, sorry, I put
You did that on purpose.
No, it was an accident.
You totally did that on purpose. How does Lilith fare, he said. This is our punter-in-chief here.
Yeah. Lilith and Sophia, what's the juxtaposition there?
Well, this is why I created my awkward animation, is I think on that edge, on that center circle, where we get paradox and doubleness, I think that's where we start to see, maybe not a full-fledged goddess culture, but at least the feminine, right? And so, yeah, you have the story of Lilith, who among the rabbis was considered Adam's first wife, and she's pretty powerful. Actually, it's a Medusa story. She's a pretty powerful being who demands that Adam lie on his back during sex, so that she has the dominant position. She's a goddess. She's powerful. But then, of course, she's cursed and by God, because sex with a woman on top is just not right, as I think we all know. And she's cursed and flees, and actually not just flees, but is put into the desert, where, what does she do, Lilith? She waylays innocent men, right, who are just wandering around in the desert, as men do. And she'll hide behind a rock in the desert, jump out, have sex with them. That's Lilith. So, Lilith Fair and other reappropriations of Lilith and Medusa are attempts to kind of recapture this missing goddess, right? The missing feminine, maybe. Yeah. Again, happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day.